Hello, this is Jason, and a new story on my author's channel.
The shadow was what caught the military's attention. Thin, almost imperceptible, as if thickening in the air, it should not have been here. On the perimeter of the base, where this unknown figure climbed with a seismic sense, there was no trace of anyone who could have left it. The point where two corridors intersected. Silence. If the border separating this moment, which someone in the future would call the beginning of the end, had not been so clear, no one would have noticed. But it was this point that became the place where everything changed. Officer Fisher, who was on duty, did not pay attention to the picture. Only a slightly tense feeling. Why did his gaze slide to this empty point at the zenith of the screens? It was not a fault of the equipment. He, having felt something, looked there again. Absolutely empty. The screen showed a camera installed along the fence, reflecting narrow strips of the border zone. But for some reason there was no person in it. It could not be. Who could overcome 4 layers of barrier fences without making a sound? While Fisher was trying to find a logical explanation, Officer Cooper, the commanding officer for the day, stood in the center of the headquarters and reviewed his daily reports. Routine tasks. But something was wrong. He had long noticed the oddity in the data. Several reports sent from different sections of the base did not match reality. So many small glitches. Tiny, almost unnoticeable errors. For example, the same GPS mark at different times. Elements in the report template that he definitely did not sign seemed to disappear. Questionable files in the database. Every word, every message now came with an inexplicable echo, from which the shadow of misunderstanding did not leave. And so, when Fisher returned to analyze the footage, his hand instinctively froze. That moment, the angled shadow on the screen. It doesn't exist in the other cameras. It appears, disappears. A moment. A second that stretches into hours. And yet everything that happens on the screen turns out to be something far more dangerous and important than it seemed. Officer Cooper didn't know his day was over. His mind was filled with reports, ID numbers, shift schedules. The usual stuff. But what he couldn't comprehend continued to haunt him. With each passing moment, something in his perception became unreal. His life was essentially a stunt with no logical conclusion. He was part of something bigger, but he understood it less and less with each passing day. That day, while checking work schedules and before going on break, Cooper noticed something odd about the reports from one of her sectors, the base closest to the walls leading to the perimeter itself. The classified facilities there were always minor, but he had seen some of them being processed. The print tag negotiations was wrong. It really shouldn't be there. He always thought about it. About those negotiations. There had to be something important to remember, but he couldn't. His memory was becoming increasingly empty. Hours were spreading into days, and this base was, at its core, nothing more than a set of barriers. Their job was simple, to keep anything from getting in from the outside. But now Cooper knew. He wasn't sure that all these barriers were working at all. And what if, in fact, there was nothing to stop someone who could breach them? After a few minutes, he shook his head, turning back to the charts. The moment when everything should have become clear had come too soon. This was not the day when everything began to unfold in small pieces. It was all too obvious to miss. His thoughts seemed to be not his own. And at the moment when he began to study the new reports, someone quietly appeared next to him. He knew what it was, but he could not immediately understand. His former colleague, an Air Force veteran who had been assigned to a new phase of service a few years ago, walked into the office without knocking, which was completely out of character. But Cooper didn't pay attention. Behind him sat the dim screen, as always, with numbers running. He had many situations that weren't resolved at first glance. Or rather, they weren't resolved at all. The military activity report stared at his eyes, but something didn't add up. For lines, commas, statistics. But now there was a figure standing nearby that was too far away to simply disappear. Cooper could still see it, even though he tried so hard not to notice it. The problem was that the veteran, the one who was his friend, seemed too strange in his own way. He started asking questions about security, about regular checks, and even saying that they couldn't trust everyone they saw there. Cooper saw one simple thing. That question was asked at the wrong level. He knew too well that somewhere beyond everything there was something elusive that couldn't be calculated. Meanwhile, in one of the most remote corners of the base, a teenager named John hid in the fog that had always been familiar to this place. Only there were no other people here. He felt like the entire system was on the brink of destroying itself. And this fact was reality. Shocked by what had happened to his life, he made his way further, feeling the almost fatal tension in the air. He knew that if he held out here for even a few more hours, discovery would be inevitable. There was no room for error. Everything he did was part of a complex game with no rules. Being in a labyrinth, in one of the most difficult places on the planet, John began to think differently. Not as a fugitive, but as an observer, as someone who would face all of his dilemmas. But there was a strange feeling that something was happening on the other side. He didn't know what it was, but he knew that if he didn't get answers now, everything would fall apart. And again, there was a strange feeling, as if none of this mattered. Everything was so interconnected and elusive that all attempts to guess the initial point of error only brought the end closer. And yet, the people around continued to live their lives, each at their post, in pursuit of meanings that could not help but echo reality. Nevertheless, the shadow was imperceptibly thickening, giving no rest. Cooper returned to the spreadsheets, which didn't quite match up with reality. A clash of rows of data that couldn't possibly have been written at the same time, but which nevertheless appeared on the screen as if they were sequential. His fingers fumbled hesitantly over the keys, trying to find that one mistake that none of his colleagues had noticed. With each word in the report, his confidence waned, and he increasingly felt like he didn't understand what was happening. The sounds that usually accompanied his work seemed distorted, as if something had disrupted their usual order. Pauses stretched, moments lost their meaning, and the light in the room grew too dim, causing strange flashes to appear in his eyes. The veteran who had just entered the office stood nearby and showed no emotion, only carefully watching Cooper's actions. His gaze was strange, not observing, but rather investigating, as if he was waiting for Cooper to discover what was hidden on the surface. "You know, Cooper," he said, his voice even but heavy, "you know this base isn't just an object. You've seen it change. It seems normal, but something's still wrong." Cooper didn't answer right away. His eyes were focused on one of the reports, on a line that seemed out of place. He started to turn it over in his head, trying to figure out what could have caused the discrepancy. Suddenly a thought occurred to him. What if the base isn't what it seems anymore? What if this is just a project? The idea was so absurd that he immediately pushed it away, but in the back of his mind it remained. "I understand what you're saying," Cooper said, but his voice was unsure. "But do you really think there's more to this than that? These are just databases, reports. All this data. It's business as usual. The problems you're seeing are just mistakes. Human error." The veteran looked at him silently, his face serene but his eyes piercing, as if he already knew what was really behind his words. "Do you remember that task we worked on together?" he asked, distracting Cooper slightly. "We were looking for deviations, possible threats that weren't immediately apparent." "I see you forgot. That was the first thing. Those reports. You don't even notice how perfectly they match up. You don't think that's a coincidence, do you?" The tone was strange. Cooper couldn't understand why the veteran's words resonated so strongly with his own doubts. He couldn't explain it, but the feeling of unreality was growing stronger. What he saw on the screen now seemed distorted, as if something in the world was no longer in place. The veteran's words, the reports, the data, all of it merged into a strange stream in which the answers were unimportant. Only the questions remained. Meanwhile, John, the teenager hiding in the fog of the base, felt his heart begin to beat faster. He knew he had to move fast. His focus was increasing, which meant his chance of success was decreasing. But that was when he noticed something strange. One of the sensors in the area he had crossed had changed color. It shouldn't have. The sensors were part of an old security system that hadn't been used in years, but they were still working. It was strange. John knew he couldn't be detected. He knew he would be safe unless he made a mistake. But the mistake had already happened. He had accidentally stepped into a place where he shouldn't have been. This wasn't just a security breach. It was something bigger, something he didn't know about. A figure appeared in front of him, in the void. Silent as the fog itself, it stood a few meters away from him, but still remained inscrutable. The gaze was hidden under the hood, but John felt that this figure was looking at him. And it was not just a look, it was a feeling of the presence of something that had nothing to do with his life. The shadow moved smoothly, without making a sound. John didn't know what to do. He couldn't believe that this wasn't just a mistake. He couldn't allow himself to think that this was the man who had infiltrated the base. But this figure moved too confidently. And at that moment, a new signal appeared on his screen. The sensors began to give out completely different data. Unusual, impossible to combine with reality. Time and space began to lose their clarity, and John realized that he had no more time. Cooper's screen showed the same strange vibrations. He knew something was wrong. He couldn't figure out why, but he knew that if he didn't act now, it would all go away. He dialed the commander's number and silently watched the numbers change. "Cooper, are you okay?" a voice said. "We're starting to lose control of the system. Can't you see what's happening?" Cooper glanced at the reports, at the strange discrepancies. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was all part of something he didn't know about. A mystery. A history that went on for far longer than he could have imagined. But when he returned to the screen again, the figure standing in front of John had disappeared. That moment when reality begins to be uncertain, like sand slipping through your fingers, became that very point of no return. Cooper felt an indescribable tightening in his chest as the call from the command center ended. He was alone in the silence, despite the vibrations inside the cabin, the feeling that the world outside had cracked and was about to fall apart. He glanced at the screen again. Temperature, pressure, coordinates, all as before, but the reports did not match. Everything had become blurry, like the water in a murky lake from which you could never escape. Every movement of the mouse, every click on the table seemed devoid of meaning, as if his actions were part of a grand experiment and not real work. He looked back at the veteran. He stood by the window, motionless, not making a single movement, but there was a hardness in his eyes that Cooper felt like a bolt of lightning. "You really don't see it?" the veteran said, without turning around. "Or do you just think everything is going according to plan? You understand that this is not just a database, not just numbers. It is a labyrinth from which there can be no exit." Cooper clenched his jaw, trying to collect his thoughts. The maze. He had seen it, this base. Every corner, every corridor was familiar. Everything was orderly, neatly organized. But what if it was just a facade? He realized that his view of the world, of all the reports and checks, was an illusion. He was looking for real answers, and they were right here, in what he had come to accept as the mundane. But something in that mundane didn't add up. He wanted to say something, to ask about what was happening, but his voice couldn't seem to come out. It was more than just panic. It was the realization that everything around him was a lie, a purposeless lie, hiding something that couldn't be seen. The shadow they had seen was gone. And John, the teenager who had become part of this strange game, was trapped. He thought he had caught the moment to act, but he didn't know he was part of it. He hid in one of the old storage rooms, hearing footsteps running through the base. The noise was too loud to go unnoticed. He crept up to one of the old screens, the ones used before the system was fully digitalized. The screen was fading, but it showed the same coordinates, the same shifts, as Cooper had seen back at the base. No one was supposed to notice. He glanced at his cheap gadget again. On the screen was a code that shouldn't be there. His fingers slid across the screen, unlocking access to a database the user had forgotten. It all felt unreal, but he had no choice. He couldn't understand what had happened to the system, but he knew intuitively. If he didn't open this file, if he didn't get the answers, the database would swallow him. And just as it would swallow her, it would swallow everyone inside. And where he stood, there was a strange feeling that no one had ever seen him. He took a few steps forward, freezing at every shadow. It seemed as if someone was watching him. But when he looked back, there was no one. And again that strange figure, a shadow moving among the walls, like a ghost, invisible but tangible. With each passing moment it became more real, more distinct. John intuitively felt that his actions were not under his control. And he was right. A moment. A second. And John saw the screen begin to change before his eyes. It wasn't just code. He felt reality itself changing. This wasn't just a bug in the system. It was an anomaly. The reports that had seemed like chaos before suddenly became more and more transparent. He could understand their meaning, knew that these lines, this text, were all becoming part of a map that led to another place. And the place he was looking for was already starting to blur. But it wasn't a place. It was time. Time that was running out. And suddenly, the screen flickered. And as if from nowhere, another line appeared. This time, it wasn't in the previous versions of the reports. The second line, coordinates that couldn't be here. Cooper saw the same moment when a line appeared on the screen that shouldn't have been there. His eyes registered it involuntarily, the same shift in coordinates. He felt that something dangerous was happening, something they couldn't understand. And then, as if nothing had happened, the screen went blank. Everything was gone. He turned to the veteran, who, as always, was watching him with an almost familiar interest. "Time," he said, as if reading Cooper's thoughts. "You can feel it, right?" he asked. "Do you understand now what's happening?" It was all prepared in advance, like a construction set about to come together at one moment. You saw this moment, and now all you have to do is choose which way to go. But you already know, wherever you end up, you won't get out. At that moment, Cooper felt something inside him break. It wasn't fear. It was despair. Because despite all his efforts, he realized he would never get out of this labyrinth. A labyrinth that was never just a base. It was a place where reality was distorted. But the scariest thing was not that he didn't know how to get out, but that he would never know what really happened. Time seemed to melt away. Cooper sat, watching the black screen, which now seemed completely empty, as if it had taken all the answers and left only empty space. The soft hum of the fans, always in the background, now seemed distant, almost inaudible. He tried to focus on sounds, on sensations, but his mind was empty. Winds, people, ordinary things. None of it seemed to matter anymore. Everything in his life had always boiled down to precise data and reports, but now even those things were as empty as the numbers on the screen. The veteran stood there, motionless as before. His gaze seemed to penetrate him. Cooper again felt unable to answer a question that had not been asked. What was going on? Why had his life and his work suddenly become part of something he could not understand? "You do realize that these reports aren't just about safety," the veteran finally said, as if interrupting Cooper's train of thought. "They're not about what's going on here. They're about what's not going on." Cooper glanced at him. Something about those words gave him a burning sense of unease. He tried to gather his thoughts, but they wouldn't come together. He knew something important was slipping away from him, but he couldn't find anything to grab onto. The shadows on the walls and the twisted outlines of the rooms now seemed part of something that was hiding over the horizon. But what? Thoughts. "It's not just a job," the veteran continued, as if not noticing that his interlocutor was absorbed in something else. "We, each of us, go through our own tasks, our own routes. We think we know what we're doing, what's right. But you've seen for yourself how everything around us changes. Time doesn't match up. Everything becomes something else. You don't know what exactly or why, but it's there. You can't ignore it, Cooper. We're all toys in someone else's hands, including you." The veteran's words sounded like a death sentence, but Cooper couldn't argue with them. What he saw no longer seemed like an accident. He knew that these reports, these meetings and conversations with colleagues were all lies. In his head, everything was gradually coming together to form one big puzzle that could not be completed. Suddenly, a message popped up on the screen in front of him that couldn't be related to the reports. A login and password for access. But they weren't in the system. It was a code that shouldn't have been there. As if someone had opened a door to a forbidden place, and the keys didn't belong to any of them. These weren't just numbers, but indications of something hidden, something that had been living outside of visible reality for a long time. Like a shadow that was waiting for the moment to come into the light. Cooper cringed at the realization. He was falling deeper into something bigger than his job. He was part of something that had no form, and it was trying to grab him. He stood up from the table, stepped towards the screen, trying to enter the necessary data, but his fingers did not obey. He did not know why this was necessary, did not know what it would change. He searched for answers, but with each new step he became more and more lost. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked, turning to the veteran. He stood motionless again, still expressionless. "I don't feel. I know. You understand that what you saw does not exist in the usual concepts. You cannot understand it. You cannot control it. Because it is not just a base, not just a task. It is a mechanism that creates space, time, reality." The silence in the room grew even thicker. And now Cooper could see the veteran's eyes looking straight at him, as if he knew more than Cooper did. Knew the answers to questions Cooper hadn't yet had time to ask. But Cooper couldn't afford to ask those questions. He didn't know where they might lead. At this time, John, hiding in one of the old tunnels, had already noticed that the atmosphere around him was changing. He felt the cold penetrate his skin, as if the base itself had swallowed him, digested him, and thrown him out into a world where everything was collapsing. He walked without looking back, despite the fact that he felt invisible eyes on him. In his hands was that very code. He couldn't explain how and why he had been looking for it for so long. He just knew that this code was the key. And now all that was left for him was to go further and find what was hidden behind this labyrinth. He stopped, approaching another door. But his attention was drawn to a detail that should not be there. An ordinary door. But in its crack, a light shone. It was not the light that came from ordinary lamps or screens. It was a light as if somewhere in this place another world was hiding, and this world was trying to break out. John couldn't believe it. He took the knife and carefully opened the door. And when it opened, the world beyond was not what he expected. It wasn't just a room or a space. It was another reality. Mirrors that reflected not just people, but things, events, and other forms of life. Shadows that moved. They weren't part of this world, but they were there. He stepped into the dark space, and everything around him began to disappear. Time flowed. The walls began to absorb him, and everything around him began to dissolve. John knew that at this moment there would be no turning back for him, and neither would Cooper. Time moved at a different pace on the base, and both of them, finding themselves in this space, became part of something that could not be fully understood. They did not realize that they were both, one way or another, walking along the same path, to the same place. Cooper awoke with an alien weight pressing down on his chest. Time seemed to have stopped, but his body felt strangely empty, as if he were moving in another dimension. He couldn't tell how long he'd been out of it. Hours? Moments? Either way, the reality around him seemed to defy the normal laws of time and space. He stood up from his chair and looked around. In the corner of the room, next to an empty desk, sat the veteran. This man was a part of everything that was happening, and yet he didn't explain it. His calm, impenetrable on the outside, suddenly seemed almost unnatural. Or was this simply a result of Cooper's own loss of the ability to perceive the world as it was? The wind, rushing through the cracks, shook the old curtains, but the sound seemed too loud, as if someone was trying to say something. The noise became deafening, like a fire burning in the void. Cooper tried to understand at what point everything had gone wrong. Why did he begin to feel as if his own steps had led him into a labyrinth from which there was no escape? The flash was the last thing he remembered, and only its whiteness echoed in his memory. "You're back, Cooper," the veteran said without moving. His voice was not a greeting. It was more an observation, clearly knowing something more. Cooper opened his mouth, trying to form words, but his breathing was labored and words wouldn't come. There was something strange in his mind that made him doubt what could have happened at all. A multitude of disparate images, fragments, sensations were superimposed on each other like layers of sand dunes, and he couldn't tell what was real and what was a distortion. "You don't need to ask questions," the veteran continued. "You already know the answer." Cooper gritted his teeth, feeling a faint nervous ache creep up his neck. This conversation wasn't real. This wasn't a meeting, it was a dream sequence, and he could feel it. But he couldn't leave. There was no structure, no reports, just pure tension. Suddenly the number appeared in front of him again, as if it had dropped out of thin air. 16,459. It kept flashing before his eyes, even when he tried to ignore it. It was the answer to a question he couldn't ask himself, but knew was there. He knew the numbers should match, but they didn't. Cooper took a step forward to get closer to the screen, but something in his mind suddenly shifted. He was almost certain that he was going to see something different than he expected. The system was giving him information that shouldn't have been available. But even at that moment, when he was almost on the verge of understanding, everything disappeared again. Logic was too fragile, too shaky, like shards of old glass, shattering into pieces before an invisible hand could gather them together. "You can't control what's happening," the veteran said, not looking at the screen. "It's going to happen on its own. You can't stop it." "I can change that," Cooper said, but his voice echoed in the empty room. The wind outside had picked up, and now it was so strong that the door seemed about to fall off its hinges. Suddenly, another number flashed across the room, an 8. But not just any 8, an 8 that changed position. It seemed to float, not having time to cool down after each movement. Cooper leaned forward, trying to focus on this symbol, but his attention was again lost. Same code, same data set, and it wasn't happening in present time. Or was it not time at all? Maybe it was happening in another dimension, where there was no space, just a cold void that embraced them? Cooper knew he couldn't trust his senses. He'd seen himself many times before, in different situations with different emotions. But each time, no matter what he did, everything he saw was part of something else. He was trapped in this web, trapped in his own reality. His actions didn't matter. Meanwhile, John moved further and further into the labyrinth of the base. The minute his feet touched the cold metal, he felt something change in his perception. It wasn't just cold. It was a cold that permeated every corner of his mind. He walked down the corridor, determined, but more and more images were beginning to form in his head. He saw fragments of his life, fragments that shouldn't be his memories. They were alien to him, as if he had transferred them from another world. In this new, altered space, everything seemed unnatural, and his own body was alien. He didn't know what he was doing, but he felt that all of this was important. It was a vital part of what was happening. Everything he was experiencing could now take no other form than a hidden, intertwined reality where nothing happened according to plan. The vague images that flashed before his eyes sometimes resembled the very coordinates that flashed so often on the screen. At that moment, John realized that the base was not just a building. It was a living being, a system that controlled everything. He knew that there was nothing he could do, and if he tried to break free, he would never see what was hidden beyond this world. But when he approached the next door, it was gone. Just as the wall he was standing next to was gone. He was moving, but he didn't feel the space. There was a feeling that he wasn't just in this place, but that he himself was a part of this place. What if he disappeared? Would the place continue to exist without him? John didn't know what to do. Everything around him was confusing, but he knew that it all made sense. And this was more than just a glitch in the system. An incredible tension gripped Cooper's body. He looked at the screen again, and despite his best efforts, the numbers and codes that flashed before his eyes became foreign to him. He tried to focus on one thing at a time, but his mind was breaking into tiny fragments that could not be pieced together. This was not a simple mistake. No, this was a process in which he had become part of the machine itself, part of something far more complex than he could understand. The veteran still didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the void, as if he hadn't belonged to this world for a long time, as if his own essence had no connection with what was happening here and now. His silence was oppressive, like a fog that doesn't disappear, but only thickens around him. Cooper took a step forward, but every movement he made was accompanied by a feeling of impossibility. He knew that this step would not lead to the goal. I can't keep looking for answers in this place, he thought. But then his gaze was drawn back to the screen. New information appeared on it. The code he had seen before had changed. 78 billion. The number still didn't make sense, but it was a sign. A sign that a way out of this state might be close, but not in this reality. He remembered reading about this once, about mysterious numbers and theorems that supposedly could open doors to other dimensions. But he didn't need those theories now. He knew that all those patterns and number combinations were just masking something much more fundamental, something so confusing that logic stopped working. You realize you can't get out of this, Cooper, the veteran said, not taking his eyes off the window. The words didn't seem to belong to the man, didn't seem to apply to his role in this situation. And yet Cooper realized that this wasn't just a warning. It was a statement. The reality he was in existed on its own terms. Time here defied human laws. What do you mean? Cooper asked, though he knew there was no simple answer to that question. He knew that even the question itself might be just one piece of the puzzle he found himself in. You're already in it, the veteran replied, not moving again. You can't get out. You'll never get out. Because this isn't just a base anymore, and it's not just you. Cooper looked at the old screen, and his eyes finally focused on one moment. He saw repeating fragments that had seemed random before. Now they were glued together into a single chain. His memory filled these fragments. One face, two doors, 3 steps to the left, a code, numbers, a moment. All this filled his inner world. He was not just an observer. He was part of this game, part of a strange system that controlled his movements, his actions. He raised his hand and touched the screen. And in that moment, something changed. Time in the room suddenly became slow, as if he were in water. Every element of space and time was stretched out, becoming part of a single overall structure. Cooper felt reality twist around him, as if in a silent chorus his own memories were beginning to take on shapes and forms that made no sense. He began to realize that the same process he was experiencing was connected to John, who was now moving through the base, into the veteran, into every person who was here. John wasn't the only one experiencing this. He was part of something bigger than just an operation, than just playing at reality and lies. He wasn't just a soldier. He was part of a system that could erase boundaries. Meanwhile, John had reached another door. He didn't know what was behind it, but he kept going. The same images were spinning in his head. Mirrors, passages, people looking at him with the same expressions, the same questions in their eyes. But now he knew. He knew that all those faces and all those answers that didn't exist were part of the system itself. He opened the door. There was nothing inside. But the nothingness wasn't dark. It was bright. And when his gaze settled on its center, John knew that there, in that place, he was supposed to be. He couldn't explain why, but his feet were leading him there, as if that center were a destination. He could feel the breeze and the cold that emanated from there. It wasn't just a smell. It was a feeling he couldn't ignore. The moment his hands touched the edge of the void made him freeze. Everything around him was moving. Everything he saw seemed to be changing distortedly. A parallel reality. Or was it one reality he was in now? He took a step forward and everything began to disappear. No door, no base, no car. Just empty space. Something began to change in Cooper's room, too. He felt time shrinking and losing all shape again. He was outside the very system he had been trying to find answers in. But they weren't here. The answers were outside time, outside logic. He already knew that what he was doing could not be a solution to the problem. It was not a search for a way out. It was part of another path that had no end. Just when Cooper realized he could no longer tell what was real and what wasn't, the screen in front of him filled with numbers again. But this time it wasn't just information. It was code. His code. The world around Cooper continued to blur. He couldn't believe his eyes. The numbers on the screen began to change with extraordinary speed, as if they were not just a display of data, but something alive, moving. Elements that he had thought unshakable were now shifting and disintegrating, like particles that had lost their connection with one another. In this chaos, he felt not fear, but a sense of inexpressible anxiety, something beyond his understanding. Something important had been lost, something that should not be forgotten. He tried to move, but his arms wouldn't obey him. It wasn't physical weakness. It was a loss of reference. He no longer knew where he was, where his feet were, or where reality was. At that moment, he realized again that he was not in control of what was happening. He had never been in control. It was not his decision, not his will, but an external force, like a thin thread, that tied him to the process, forcing him to move in a certain direction, giving him no choice. Suddenly, everything stopped. The screen went blank, and in the darkness his figure was no more than part of a shadow. He took a step to the side, feeling the air grow thicker, the space shrink. Cooper turned slowly. He heard no footsteps, felt no sound, but he knew he was not alone. Someone was there, watching him. It was more than a feeling. It was a knowing. He looked up. There was a man standing before him. He was unlike anyone Cooper had ever seen before. This man was a silent witness, like Cooper himself. He was there for a reason, but he couldn't be a part of what was happening. All he could see was his own reflection in the man's eyes. A strange feeling came over him, as if this man was not just an object in his world, but reality itself. "You already understand what's going on," the man said. His voice was neither loud nor harsh, but his words sent an icy chill through his chest. Cooper was silent. He didn't know what to say. He saw that the man was silent too. There was no condemnation or sympathy in his eyes. He was empty, like the universe itself, empty and endless. "This isn't your game, Cooper," the man continued. "You're just watching it happen." Cooper felt his body tense to the limit. He tried to find words, but nothing made sense. The fear was not in what was happening around him, but in the fact that he could not find his purpose in this place. He felt his soul losing its support. Meanwhile, John continued to walk through the empty corridors of the base. The shadow of his steps seemed unnaturally long, and the space itself seemed slightly distorted. He had long since stopped trying to understand where he was and why. He was simply moving. That was all that mattered. But even that movement seemed strange, as if his steps were directed not toward any specific place, but toward some strange state where space did not exist. The corridor narrowed. The walls changed, becoming more and more curved. Everything began to resemble a huge spiral that led him deeper. At some point, where the exact direction no longer made sense, he felt the darkness growing thicker, as if the base itself was dissolving into space, dissolving along with his consciousness. He stopped. There was a door ahead. But it wasn't just a door. It was alive. He could feel the air around it shifting, its very surface changing shape, as if it had no solidity, but was made of something else, something elusive. John took a step toward the door, and as his hand touched the handle, the space around him completely disappeared. It was not a feeling of disorientation. No, it was a disappearance of boundaries, of the very foundations of existence. Everything became flat, insubstantial. In that moment, John understood. He was no longer a person, but a part of something greater. He was no longer in this world. He was beyond this world. Holding his breath, he opened the door. There was nothing inside. There was no darkness, no light. Just a void that stretched on forever, like space without stars. But in that void, there was one element. There, in the center, was an object. He didn't know what it was, but it was what he was looking for. He stepped inside. The emptiness around him instantly disappeared, replaced by an unimaginable feeling of emptiness and fullness at the same time. His entire being was enveloped by an invisible force that pulled him, tearing apart the boundaries of his consciousness. Just as John had stepped through the door, Cooper felt his consciousness fade. All he could sense was the presence of this man standing before him. He didn't know who he was, but he knew that this man couldn't be part of his world. He was something more complex than just an individual. His presence was akin to what John had felt as he walked through the base. "You still don't understand," the man said, his gaze unblushing. He looked at Cooper not as a living being, but as something that might just be a function. He wasn't real. He was part of something that didn't exist. And Cooper felt it. The thin lines of reality began to crack. At that moment, he knew that he could no longer understand where his reality ended and where someone else's began. The man's gaze pierced him like a knife in the fog that no one could see. And only this feeling, a rupture in time, filled the entire space in which he was. John found himself in this space. Everything disappeared again. Cooper couldn't understand what was happening. He tried to decipher this moment, trying to reconnect with reality, with a world that seemed to have disappeared. But his efforts were futile, as if reality itself had disintegrated into molecules that had never existed. He wasn't sure if this was reality at all, or if he had found himself in a place where the boundaries between reality and fiction were erased. At first, there was a feeling of lightness, as if his body had become part of the air. Then came a heaviness, not physical, but invisible. He felt his feet touching something solid, but it was a strange sensation, as if the ground beneath him was not quite what he was used to seeing it as. It seemed to change its density and shape, to slide under his feet, disappear, and reappear. Time ceased to have meaning. All moments were like crumpled pages that no one could compile back into a book. A memory flashed through his mind, hazy, unclear, but clear. When he was little, his mother would tell him stories about how the world we lived in could be just one facet of a much more complex and multifaceted existence. Stories about how people who entered these other worlds lost themselves, forgot who they were, and were never able to return. A strange sense of familiarity washed over him. Here, in this place, where the past and future lost their clarity, as if the world itself were just a collection of memories in which nothing was real. "You can't go back now, Cooper," said the man standing in front of him. His voice sounded as if it had passed through kilometers of space and time, and all that was left was the sound itself, devoid of any connection to reality. There was no emotion, no aggression in those words. It was just a fact. And that fact was shrinking in his mind like a snake squeezing its prey. Why? Cooper could barely get the words out. He knew the question didn't make sense, but he asked it anyway. He was searching for something that would bring him back. But there was none. There was no answer. All he knew was that the boundaries of his existence had been violated. "Because you're not the only one here," the man replied, but there was no judgment in his eyes. They were empty, yet full. There was something elusive about them, as if he were part of something greater, rather than just a separate being. Cooper tried to focus. He had to understand something. He couldn't leave this without an answer. His mind searched for a connection, for a thread that could bring him back to this world. But the more he tried to understand, the more it felt like these questions didn't matter. He was trapped, and his existence was nothing more than a fragment of something much more complex. At that moment, a movement caught his attention. He didn't immediately understand where it was coming from, but in the air in front of him, something had changed. It wasn't a change in shape or color. It was something else. It was as if the space in front of him had become something alive, something that responded to his presence. He took a step forward. The space changed. It became less distinct, as if another door had opened before him, a door to another dimension where reality continued to exist, but its laws were different. He felt everything around his body changing. His perception of time became flexible, and every thought that came into his head became not just thoughts, but part of this other world. This world was not subject to the laws he knew. There was no single time here. There were no fixed forms. There was no past and future, only a now that was intertwined with something greater. Suddenly, in this world where all boundaries were erased, Cooper heard footsteps. He couldn't understand who was next to him, but he knew that these steps could not be his. They came from somewhere deep in this strange space. He looked around, trying to find the source of the sound, and then his gaze stopped on what seemed to him to be a mirror. It was a strange reflection. There was nothing in it except Cooper himself, but the reflection was warped, as if the space behind it was empty, but in fact it left traces. Traces that could not belong to this reality. He approached the mirror. The expectation of something impossible grew in his chest, as if this mirror could be not just an object, but a door to other worlds. But the closer he got, the more he felt that this reflection was not his. It was different. It could not be him. When Cooper touched the surface, everything around him began to disintegrate again. He didn't understand what exactly had happened, but inside him there was a feeling that he had become part of this emptiness. He didn't know how, but he was there, in this emptiness, in this strange world where the past and the future lost their shape. And then his eyes met the man again. There was something new in his gaze, which was no longer empty but hard, like something that had lived forever. He was no longer part of the world Cooper had been in before. This man was what controlled this space. "Do you know who you are, Cooper?" he asked. But there was something different in his voice now. It wasn't just a statement. It was a question. Cooper was silent. But a thought entered his mind. Maybe I shouldn't have been looking for answers? Maybe this was all over long ago? At that moment, as if hearing his thoughts, the man approached. "This is not the end, Cooper. This is the beginning." Cooper couldn't believe his ears. "This is the beginning." The words sounded like a sentence and at the same time like some strange promise. He felt his consciousness cracking again, as if it were falling apart into separate pieces that could not be assembled into a single picture. His whole life, everything he had known, now seemed like an illusion, nothing more than some game with rules he could not understand. What was this beginning? He tried to understand, but instead of the answers he so desperately sought, he felt his perception blurring. The world he had lived in was gone, the beliefs he had come to accept as unchangeable. There was only emptiness around him, as if everything that had once made up his reality had vanished in an instant. The basic structure of existence was crumbling, and no new structure was emerging in its place. In its place was simply something foggy, full of fragments of thoughts, feelings, and invisible connections. "You don't understand, do you?" the man said again. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the space with such heaviness that Cooper felt sparks of panic begin to flare up inside him. But he still couldn't understand what they were talking about. The man took a step forward, and the space in front of him changed again. It wasn't just a sideways movement. It was a change in reality itself, as if the man were part of it, as if he could manipulate time and space, changing their shape. Cooper felt his body becoming light again, and his thoughts, so recently so heavy and tangled, began to glide smoothly across the surface, leaving no trace. He tried to stop it, but his hands did not obey. He could neither resist nor find support. "You need to understand that you are not here by chance," the man said, and there was something strangely familiar in his words, as if they had been spoken before, in another time, another place. "You chose this path. You chose to be part of what you saw, and now you must understand that this is not just your choice. It is the choice of everything you have known and everything you could know." But Cooper couldn't understand what was meant. He was ready to ask questions, ready to find an answer to his tormenting riddle, but this space, this anomaly, wouldn't let him speak. Everything was alien. Everything was beyond his control. And then those warped mirrors appeared before him again. They weren't simple reflections. They were windows. Windows into other realities where he saw himself, but not as he was. In one of those reflections, he saw himself at the base, standing among the dusty, empty corridors, in the very place he had been trying to escape from. In another reflection, he was standing at the edge of the forest, looking at the sky, full of unknown luminaries. In the third reflection, he was in a completely different time, in a world where people lived differently, where the rules of the game were different, where space and time were subject to different laws. He felt a sharp compression inside himself, as if his body had been compressed to incredible limits. Each image in these mirrors was not only a reflection, but something else. It was a look into infinity, where time and space intertwined. Each image was not just a picture. It was a moment of his possible existence. "Do you see?" the man said, and his voice was now like an echo, like a response from somewhere deep within. Cooper couldn't answer, didn't know how to answer. He couldn't understand what was happening. He was trapped, but not just trapped in this place. He was trapped in time itself. Every image, every reflection, was a possibility of him. He saw himself, but he also knew that he wasn't himself, and that this person in front of him wasn't anyone in particular either. He was part of something else, something much bigger and unknown. "You create these realities," the man said. "You search for meaning in them, trying to find yourself. But you can't find who you are, because you've never been alone in your world." Cooper felt everything around him dissolving again. He stood in the center of this labyrinth, surrounded by thousands of mirrors that reflected him, but each time differently. He could no longer distinguish where he ended and where everything else began. You weren't supposed to come here," the man said, and his face, though expressionless, showed some trace of longing in his eyes, of the hatred he had behind his mask. "But you chose this path. You allowed yourself to lose control. And now you must realize that you have become part of all this. You are not just a person. You are part of a system that no longer obeys any laws." The words were like a blow to the heart. Cooper felt his consciousness shrinking again. He couldn't believe it, but at the same time he felt his understanding crumbling, his reality losing its meaning. Everything was becoming absurd. But he was connected to this world. He had become part of this game, and he couldn't get out of it. "You can't go back," the man repeated, and there was something primal in his voice, in the repetition, that defied analysis. He was more than just a man. He was something more. He was a symbol, an embodiment of something Cooper couldn't comprehend. At that moment, Cooper realized he wasn't here by accident. Everything that was happening to him was part of not just his personal journey, but something bigger. This base, this reality, this world, all of it was more than just a game. It was a trap, and he was part of it. He could no longer get back what he had lost, but he had to understand what he had actually lost, and how he could become more than just a spectator in his own life. But how to get out? And was it even possible? With every step Cooper took, he felt reality crumbling into fragments, his consciousness swallowing up more and more unanswered questions. He stood frozen in a world where nothing was real, but nonetheless existed. He couldn't believe what was happening, but he felt it. This was his existence. He couldn't control space, time, or his own thoughts. When he turned back to the mirrors, he realized that this was not just a reflection. This was him, reflected in infinite variations, in which his existence became not just a matter of choice, but something darker and more inevitable. He saw himself in different situations, in different worlds, but they all carried the same emptiness. He felt that each of these worlds was not just an illusion, but a part of his own reality, a closed circle from which there was no escape. This was not a test. It was an endless repetition of himself. "You still don't understand," the man said, his voice no longer a simple statement, but a gesture that made no sense. His words were as light as breathing, but they penetrated every cell of Cooper's consciousness. "This isn't just reality, Cooper. It's a simulation. A series of simulations you're creating for yourself, hoping to find answers to questions you may never have asked yourself. You're trapped in your own mind. You're not an observer here. You're an actor forgetting his lines." Cooper stared at the man, puzzled. The words didn't add up. But it was more than just an inability to understand. It was a sense that reality itself was questioning any attempt to comprehend it. "Simulation?" His voice was distant, like an echo reflected off 1,000 mirrored surfaces. "What do you mean?" The man took a slow step toward him, and the space in front of them began to shift again. Cooper felt his body lose its solidity. He felt the entire world around him slow down, time stretching out, as if all the moments of this existence were falling into some kind of funnel. "You think that you'll find a way out someday," the man said, "that you'll somehow choose the right door, enter the right reflection, and go home. But you can't go home. You've never been home. You've never been where you came from." Cooper felt his consciousness begin to fragment, each of those fragments seeming to be part of something greater. He saw himself in those mirrors, but now there was nothing real in their reflection. Everything was filled with the same blurry light, as if the space around him was saturated with unclean time. You were lost a long time ago, the man continued. The moment you made your decision. When you found yourself at the base, when your path crossed this context. You thought you were playing by the rules. But these rules change. Every step you take is a step into the unknown. Every word the man said penetrated his consciousness as if it were part of an internal mechanism that operated independently of his will. It was as if Cooper were not simply listening, but becoming part of that mechanism. He felt his thoughts being lost in a whirlpool, and he himself was just a piece in a much more complex game. So what now? His voice dropped to a whisper, because he didn't know what to hope for, and at what point all of this had become absurd. What should I do? The man did not answer at once. He simply stood before him, like a figure that did not obey the usual laws, like something that was a law in itself. You need to understand that none of this matters, he said, and again there was no threat or comfort in his words. They were simply a statement of the inevitable. Your actions are meaningless because you have already forgotten that you exist. Everything you see is nothing more than a reflection of your own inner world. You yourself have become part of what was once only an observation. You are here because your mind could not perceive its reality. You created this world, and you yourself do not realize that you are its creator. Cooper felt his mind shrink again, his whole life, his whole story, become nothing. He couldn't stop this stream of thoughts, this endless series of events that seemed to be spinning out of his control. He tried to go back, but he didn't know where. All he knew was that he wasn't ready for what he was about to understand. You can't control this, Cooper, the man continued. You were part of what you created. And you weren't alone. You and others like you were part of a game that went on for much longer than you realize. At that moment, Cooper felt the space around him begin to disappear, and his consciousness was once again carried away into the depths of the dark ocean of time. He was no longer sure where it began or where it ended. He was not sure that he himself had ever existed in this world, in this context. Everything seemed illusory, blurred. He could see the world disappearing before him, timelines intersecting, merging, and then diverging again, making no sense. But in that emptiness, he sensed something important. Was he not this very moment, in which all decisions, all choices, all regrets, and all fears vanished in a single instant? Was he not precisely what lay at the center of this chaos, like an unconscious reference point? Suddenly he realized that none of this was a coincidence. He was part of a larger mechanism that defied logic and rational explanation. It was all a chain of events that ended in the very depths of his mind. And then, when the space before him again became boundless, like the ocean, when everything seemed lost, Cooper heard a whisper, "This is not the end yet." Everything froze. Time seemed to have been compressed into a single point, and Cooper couldn't understand what exactly was happening. The whisper wasn't just a sound. It was an impulse that penetrated his every cell, every thought. He knew it wasn't the end, but he didn't know it was the beginning. He tried to gather the fragments of his consciousness, but they slipped away, dissolving in this blurry space. He looked around. Everything was familiar and alien at the same time. It was a place, but it was changing, shifting like a plastic form, stretching and bending into new contours. He found himself in front of the mirrors again, but now they weren't just reflections. They were ports to other worlds, to other realities that seemed as real as the one he was in. And in each mirror he saw his own face, not one, but many. They were his possible selves, versions of himself, existing simultaneously. And then Cooper realized that each mirror wasn't just showing him a reflection, it was showing the result of what he could have become. Each of his selves was the result of a decision he hadn't made, a choice he hadn't made. He felt his consciousness dissolving into these worlds, as if each of these paths were part of his essence. But which one was the real one? "You want to understand," said the man standing next to him. He was not quite human, but rather something that was beyond any earthly definition. His presence felt like a thick shadow, like some inevitability that could not be fought. But understanding is not what you seek. You seek not knowledge, but return. You seek a way home. But what was home to Cooper? He didn't know, couldn't remember if he'd ever had a home. His whole existence was now nameless, empty. He felt like a lonely traveler in vast worlds where space and time had no rules. "You can't go back," the man continued, "because you were never there. Everything you knew wasn't true. It was just your mind's attempt to create an illusion of order. You tried to put it all back, as if it were possible. But you don't understand. You can't go back to a place you created." Cooper felt his thoughts slowing again. He was not just a traveler. He was the creator of these worlds. These mirrors were not just reflections, they were his own constructs, his consciousness creating them. And each of these worlds was the result of his internal struggle. But what was really there? He felt his mind begin to break again, trying to hold on to any one point of support. He tried to find an answer, but there were no answers. He stood before this mirror, and the world he saw in it seemed as real as his own existence. And this world was his, and it was not. "You can't know," the man said, and his voice was more serious, as if he already knew something Cooper had no idea about. "You were part of something bigger than you could possibly comprehend. All your attempts to understand what was happening were merely attempts to escape your own shadow." Cooper felt the space around him begin to change shape again. He saw the lines blurring, the outlines of everything around him becoming unclear. He tried to remember who he was, tried to find a reason for what was happening here, but it was like trying to hold water in his hands. "You want to go back," the man continued, "but you have no past. You can't go back to the moment you thought was the beginning. Everything you knew was an illusion." The dark room before him began to change its structure. Cooper noticed how the air became colder, how the walls began to move, and how the space became increasingly flat, almost two-dimensional. He felt his body, his consciousness, becoming less and less tangible. Everything around him became blurry, but at the same time sharp and clear. In this emptiness, he felt something that was like loneliness, an empty space in which his existence lost all meaning. "You can't understand because you are what you are trying to understand," the man said, his voice filled with restless anxiety. "You can't understand because you're the game. You were part of this simulation from the beginning. You became part of this construct." His words echoed in Cooper's mind. He stood before a mirror, but the mirror no longer showed his face. It was empty. He tried to understand what this meant, but there was nothing in that empty mirror that could answer his question. He stood before a void in which all his thoughts disappeared. "This is not the end," the man said again, and now his words sounded like the final truth. "This is not the end, because the end does not exist. Time has no meaning here, and neither do you." These words were like the last veil that hid the whole picture. He realized that all this was not the end. This was just another stage. A stage that had no meaning, no way out, no path. Everything was looped, like an endless cycle that could not be completed. Time and space had no meaning. "You created this world, Cooper," the man said, "and now you yourself cannot leave it. You were part of it all along. Your reality is your trap. You became what you were looking for. And you were the one asking questions you did not want to know the answers to." The world before him vanished again. But now that he was left in the void, Cooper realized that there was no end and no beginning. All of this was simply part of some larger process that he could not comprehend. And just as he had become part of this game, he remained in it, not knowing how many times he would relive this moment. As the space around Cooper took shape again, he felt not only the emptiness but also the weight of this return. This was not just a place. It was something that defied the laws of space and time. He could not understand where he was, but one question was clear in his mind. Why am I here again? He tried to believe that this was just another trick of his mind, another illusory moment. But his body was right. He felt her weight. He stood before the same mirror, but now his reflection was different. Not like before. It was more real. Cooper looked into the eyes of his reflection and felt something hidden behind that look. Not him, but something that had always remained hidden beyond his understanding. The mirror did not show him as a whole figure. It showed him in fragments. Fragments of his soul. These fragments were scattered across rooms, across time, across the worlds he created. Every move he made was a step into one of these realities. But they were always with him. He saw his own face in the reflection distort, changing, each time presenting him in a new reality. But at the same time his images merged with others, losing all individuality. Cooper tried to take a step back, but his legs did not move. He was trapped, a trap from which there was no escape. He understood. This was not just a simulation. This was his soul. He himself was the system that the man had spoken of. He was not just a part of it, he was its center. And when he tried to free himself, he only created new worlds, new steps, new repetitions. He himself became his own shadow, trapped in a circle from which there was no way out. And this circle was not just temporary, it was eternal. Time and space existed only to keep him there. His eyes met the mirror again. But this time it was not a simple reflection. He saw not only himself, but others as well. He realized that this world he lived in was a reflection of the worlds he himself was trying to build. And he was not just an observer. He was their creator. He was the one who held the keys to these worlds, but he could not leave them. He took a step forward, but the familiar space did not appear before him. Instead, another scene, another world, appeared before him. It was a world he could not immediately comprehend. He stood in the very place where he had once been. It was an American military base, but now everything was strange, distorted. The walls of the buildings were breaking, turning into fragments. Everything around him was unstable, as if the world itself was collapsing beneath him. He was surrounded by the remnants of what had once been reality, but now they were mere echoes. In this blurry space, Cooper felt more than just lost. He felt like his entire existence was being reduced to an empty shell. Every move he made was part of a hazy picture in which he was an unimportant element. He tried to figure out what was wrong, but the answers weren't coming. He returned to the mirror, but now there was no reflection. He was disappearing. There was emptiness in the mirror, as if Cooper himself had dissolved into this endless trap, not understanding that there was no beginning and no end. He could not return, could not continue. He had become part of this world, with no way to find a way out. Time was not important. Space was meaningless. He remembered the words of that man. You yourself created this world, and you yourself became its prisoner. But were those words true? Was he really part of this construct? Part of a game he couldn't fully comprehend? He didn't know. He still didn't know what it was. All he could feel was the same cold, the same vast emptiness that was pulling him deeper and deeper. But then something changed. He felt his consciousness begin to recognize something that had been forgotten. He remembered his first step into this world. He remembered the moment he first came here. He remembered how he had searched for answers, how he had tried to find meaning, and it all seemed part of a single chain. And now he understood. He was not a simple element in this construct. He was a part of it. But more importantly, he was the key. He was the one who held power over this world. He himself could change it, but only if he understood what exactly he had to do. What exactly he had to choose to be free. At that moment, Cooper felt something change inside him. He couldn't figure out what it was, but the feeling was inescapable. It was as if his entire existence was being adjusted to a single point, and that point was the key. It was only important to recognize it. Everything around him continued to distort. Space, once clear and understandable, was now as shaky as a reflection in water. But in this world, Cooper couldn't remain still. He had to act. He had to understand. Gradually, with each passing moment, his thoughts began to form a logical chain. And at that moment he realized, his choice was not to look for the answer. He was that answer. His whole life, his whole existence, was part of one big game, one big experiment. But there was no goal. There was no end. You are your own prisoner, Cooper, the voice repeated, and now it sounded less like a threat and more like something inevitable. You are your own freedom. You are your own prison. And you will search for answers until you realize that there is no answer, no question. But Cooper didn't answer anymore. He couldn't. With every word, with every moment, his understanding became clearer. He wasn't part of some grand design. He was the design. Cooper stood still, but it was an illusion. He felt his body and consciousness merging with this world, disappearing into space. He couldn't believe what was happening. He couldn't understand how it all connected. With each new revelation, with each movement, the reality around him became more and more shaky. He couldn't call it a world. He couldn't even call it space. Everything was mixed up. Everything was in one. But something changed inside him. He felt it. It was as if someone or something inside him was beginning to awaken from a long sleep, from an eternal endless cycle. And this awakening was painful. It was the realization that his whole life, this whole eternal game, everything that was happening to him, was not accidental. He was not just a part of this world, he was its essence. The world around him began to disintegrate, to turn into a dark liquid, as if reality itself was losing its shape and stability. Cooper felt his own consciousness sliding through the liquid, his thoughts, actions, and sensations lost in the vortex. He tried to find something permanent, something to attach himself to, but everything disappeared, dissolved, and in its place there was emptiness. He began to feel like he was not just a spectator, but a part of that very emptiness, a part that had no beginning and no end. At that moment, he understood. He knew that what he was experiencing was not just his individual experience. It was not his path. It was his meaning. He himself was what held all these worlds and concepts together. He was the one who was searching for answers and yet could not find them. It was a curse, but also a liberation. The answers were not important, because the process of searching was not something external, it was part of Cooper himself. And if he continued to search for answers, he only strengthened the process of searching. There were no answers. He was the question, and the question was endless. Then a new image appeared before him. It was not exactly a mirror, but rather something that only resembled it. It did not show a face, but a certain form, alternating in a chaotic order. Everything spun again, as if in a spatial spiral. He saw his hands, but he could not understand whether they were his hands. He saw himself, but it was only an image, nothing more. Each movement he made gave a new turn in the search. This was not a game of the mind. This was a reality created by his own desire to search. And now he understood that this reality could not exist without him. "You are here," said the same voice, and now it sounded like something deeper than an echo. "You are this world. You created this world. You are the cause of everything you experience. You cannot find a way out because you are the way out. You are the door, but you can never open it." Cooper felt his mind and body merge with space again. He became one with this world. His thoughts became part of this emptiness, and this emptiness became part of him. But even in this state, he knew he couldn't stay in this world forever. There were too many unanswered questions. Too many strange memories, fragments that didn't fit together. He began to feel his mind filling with disjointed fragments of other worlds, other realities. It was as if he could see himself in them, could return to the places he had once been, but these memories weren't his. These were the very memories he had created himself, creating worlds and lives around him. He found himself back in the same room. The room he had seen before, but this time it was different. It was not the same as before. This room was broken. Its walls were fractured, as if it had gone through 1,000 different forms and transformations. The walls were destroyed and rebuilt, but they did not return to their previous form. This was a place where there were no stable structures, where reality was constantly changing. But now Cooper understood. He himself was the one creating this destruction. He himself was the destruction. "You want to get out?" the voice said, "but you can't. You yourself are the one who holds this world together. You yourself are the one who creates these worlds and these voids. You can't get out because you yourself are the way out. You yourself create this game, and you can never finish it because you are its center." At that moment, Cooper felt his consciousness finally merge with this world. He became part of this process. He became part of an endless simulation that had no end. But there was no tragedy in this. He did not feel pain. He simply was. He was part of something greater than understanding. He himself created these worlds, but he could not fully understand them. He himself was part of this cycle, and although his mind tried to free itself, he knew that it could not. He was not just a prisoner, he was both the prison and the key to it. The mirror appeared again, and Cooper looked into it, but now he did not see himself. He saw a world that had just been destroyed, a world that was being reborn again, a world where his reflection disappeared into the void. Everything began again in the same place, in the same space, and this circle could never be completed. He realized that there was no point in searching for answers, because the answers were part of this endless game, and the process of searching itself was the answer he was looking for. And this answer was eternal. As space regained form, Cooper felt that the reality he found himself in was still fluid, unstable. Every movement he made created new lines, new cracks in the world he now found himself in. He could no longer pinpoint what was his body and what was the space that surrounded him. Time and space had become abstractions to him, concepts that had lost all concreteness. He no longer knew whether he was a person or whether he was the world he was trying to understand. There were no more questions in his head. The answers had disappeared along with them. He could not understand what he himself was, but he knew. This world was a figment of his mind, and once his mind was freed from time and space, it meant that his role in this world was over. And yet, despite this awareness, his consciousness continued to move, his perception was active, as if he were still trying to find that one key that could destroy the illusion. But something had changed. He realized the key did not exist, because he was that key. The same fragments of reality that no longer caused surprise appeared before him. These fragments did not try to explain what was happening, they simply were. They were not real. but they were not false either. They were an intermediate state, like everything around him. But now Cooper saw them not as accidents, but as patterns. They were steps that followed one another, leaving no trace behind. He could not explain exactly how he managed to understand this, but he felt that all these fragments no longer made sense. They just were. He wasn't searching. He was part of what he needed to find. He was part of everything. The voice spoke again, but now its words did not sound like a sentence. It was nothing more than a shadow, searching for its form in the void. The words were empty and calm. You found what you were looking for. You became who you always were. Cooper stood in this vast space that had no time or physical boundaries, and he felt something strange. There was no fear, no excitement, no desire for completion. There was not even a desire to leave. Everything he had experienced was part of what he was creating. And now he was part of this process, without desire or purpose. He tried to close his eyes, but he couldn't. He realized that his eyes no longer existed in the usual sense. He could no longer define what closing was. Everything was one and at the same time infinite. His consciousness dissolved into this vast existence, into what had once been called the world. And again fragments emerged, images, scenes that were familiar. He saw himself in other lives, in other worlds, and all these worlds and lives were now part of his own existence. He could not tell who was first, who was last. He was everything. He was infinity. But even in this new perception, this new awareness, he couldn't shake the feeling of being locked in. No matter how hard he tried to explain it to himself, he couldn't understand what was happening to him. He was made to search for answers, but now that he had found them, he couldn't leave them behind. He was still searching. And then, as if space had suddenly compressed into a single moment, a new form appeared before him. It was not a mirror. It was not a reflection. It was his world itself, his creation, his outlet. He took a step forward, but the space had not changed. He was still standing among the fragments, among the emptiness, but now it had all become part of him. He realized that everything he had experienced did not matter, because he was all that existed. He had become a closed circle, which he himself had created. Now, instead of trying to find a way out, he became part of the answer. This whole game, all his searching, all the illusions, they were part of who he was. He realized that there was no point in looking beyond this. All that had been and all that would be was just one and the same point. He himself was the one who held the world, but he was not the world. He could no longer distinguish what was real from this world and what was part of his mind. Everything was dissolved, and now there was no answer, no question. Everything was one. He stood in emptiness, but he did not feel lonely. This was the very place where neither time nor space existed. He was there, where everything was at once, and at the same time, nothing. At that moment, the sky flashed before him, but it wasn't real. It was just a reflection of his mind. He looked at it, knowing that it wasn't the world. It was the result of his creation. Everything he created disappeared in the blink of an eye, turning into whatever he wanted to see. There was no beginning, no end. Time did not exist. Everything that had been was part of his quest, part of the endless game he found himself in. But now he realized it would never end. He became a part of it, and this process had no end. He was free, but he could not understand what freedom meant. For freedom was a game that he himself could not complete. And so it all remained, an eternal circle, closed and endless. And somewhere in his mind, somewhere deep inside, a thought arose that he tried to voice, but could not. It's all me. But even this thought disappeared, dissolved into infinity. And the world continued to exist. Cooper was alone again. Everything that had happened before this moment had been erased, as if the world itself had decided that it should not remember those it had created. There was nothing to indicate the path he had taken. There were no fragments, no traces, only absolute silence and emptiness. He knew he was here now, but what did here mean? He understood that there was no space he was not in, no time that did not envelop him. He was part of it all, and he could not separate himself from what he saw. There was no question or answer in him. He simply was. That was all. Suddenly, a man appeared before him, or rather, a figure. He was one of those who had once accompanied him, one of those who were nothing more than an illusion, and yet this man seemed real. Cooper could not say for sure who it was, but everything he felt told him that this figure held the key to answers. And yet, despite this presence, Cooper felt an emptiness that even this man could not fill. "You're here," he said. His voice was familiar, but as shaky as everything else. You couldn't be anywhere else. Where am I? Cooper asked. The words sounded strange, as if they themselves were just an echo of some other world. The man was silent, and then his figure began to dissolve, as if it itself was becoming part of the void Cooper had left behind. Everything disappeared, as before. He was alone again, and space and time had disappeared. Or, more accurately, they had never existed. And then, as if by some unknown force, he realized the reality in which he existed had never been stable. Every element, every idea, every question, all of it was temporary and artificial. He could not answer the main question, because this question itself was an integral part of everything he experienced. He was neither a creator nor a destroyer. He was both at once. He was part of a game that had no players and no rules. And now he was so deeply a part of it that he could not tear himself away from it. Everything was one. But suddenly something else appeared before him, something he had not expected to see. He saw himself. He himself became what was once another. He became the one who created this world. He himself was part of this endless cycle, part of what would never end. Before him, in that empty space, a new fragment of reality appeared. It was a reflection of himself, but with a certain tint. He realized that this was not just his image, it was his I, which could never be different. It was the realization that even his own search, his attempts to understand, were part of this game. He was inside this circle, and this circle was not only his limitation, but also his liberation. He saw how this circle continued to rotate, how his past and future intertwined, how one reality replaced another. He was in this circle, and he could not get out. He stood in front of this mirror that did not show his reflection, but only his image, his particle, the part of him that had always been in him but was hidden. And he realized that this was not just a game, not just a search. This was life itself, reality itself. This was the essence of his existence. But despite this awareness, he still felt that something was wrong, as if something was missing. He couldn't figure out what it was. And then, the last form appeared before him. The last facet, the last fragment he needed to see. It wasn't an image. It wasn't a reflection. It was meaning. You were always a part of this, said the voice, echoing in the void. You can't choose where to be. You're already here. You're both the answer and the question. Cooper tried to answer, but he couldn't. He didn't know what to say, because all the words he could say made no sense. There were no answers. There was no past, no future. He was in a place where all there was eternity. But when he realized this, when he realized that everything had already been, that he was already part of this world, this process, he felt his own I begin to disappear. It was not a painful disappearance. It was a release. He was dissolving, and the space around him began to disintegrate. He left, but it wasn't the end. An empty space appeared before him, but he already knew everything was starting again. And this new cycle was, like the previous ones, part of his search. Everything was interconnected, and there was no beginning or end to it. He realized that despite all his efforts, despite all his searching and torment, he could not get out. Because he was part of this world. This world was his, and he was part of this world. The vague shadow of himself disappeared into infinity, and around him there remained only emptiness.
More interesting things to come. Be sure to watch the next video or check you the playlist. There you will find even more yourself and existing. Thanks for the likes, comments and your support. It really helps to develop the channel.